As we continue with Ethos, our next discussion is concerning verb, tense, and voice. Now, we're discussing 5 elements of style that affect voice and distance. In Ethos, we consider voice and distance. In other words, we're concerned with rhetorical distance. We're concerned with the proximity between the speaker and the audience, and the felt distance, how much an audience relates, or how little an audience relates with an author, with the writer or the speaker. And that's a part of Ethos, a part of our consideration. Again, we want to maintain the appropriate distance between speaker and audience. Sharon Crowley called verb, tense, and voice the most influential element in establishing voice and distance. I would add also that it is the most overlooked. Very rarely do students, when they're writing or speaking, pay attention to verb, tense, and voice. We write, but we don't think about whether we're using active voice or passive voice. When speech is overly passive, the audience feels removed from the speech. The audience may not understand why either. Audiences normally are not trained to think about active or passive voice, unless you have a lot of English teachers in your audience, and then you want to pay careful attention to your grammar. But most audiences are not composed of grammar teachers, unless, of course, you're teaching to a guild of grammar teachers. Then you've got a problem, especially if you use poor English. But that being said, most of the time the audience is not thinking about whether you're using active voice or passive voice. Nonetheless, your use of active and passive voice will affect the way the audience feels and the connection that they feel with you as the author. Now, it may be that that's the point, is to remove that connection. If the occasion calls for it, then you would use more of the passive voice. But generally speaking, writing is more crisp and direct and brief, or you're able to achieve brevity if you use the active voice. And the active voice gives punch to what you're saying, and so you would not ever want to be overly passive in your writing. So let's start with tense. The tenses that we consider here are present and past tense. We won't have much, if anything, to say about the future tense. Here's what you need to understand. The present tense gives a sense of immediacy and thus a sense of participation. Makes the audience feel involved. You should think about that when you're writing or speaking. Past tense happened in the past, and so it naturally is more removed. It removes the immediacy and therefore removes participation and therefore increases distance. So consider the difference between these two statements. Statement number 1. My teacher tells me I need to study harder. All right? Then consider this the same sentence in the past tense. My teacher told me I need to study harder. The first one gives more of a sense of immediacy. I think that illustrates what we're talking about here. It's a subtle difference. But the present tense gives the sense that this is happening even as we speak. Strunk and White suggest that using the present tense in summaries, especially in summaries of drama, poems, stories, or novels, the present tense makes the story come alive even in your summary. It makes the reader feel like they're a part of it. Let me give you their example. Hang on a second, and I'll read it to you. A summary of the story of Romeo and Juliet, or a part of that story. Sorry. I'm all thumbs trying to find this. Chance prevents Friar John from delivering Friar Lawrence's letter to Romeo. Meanwhile, owing to her father's arbitrary change of the day set for her wedding, Juliet has been compelled to drink the potion on Tuesday night, with the result that Balthasar informs Romeo of her supposed death before Friar Lawrence learns of the non-delivery of the letter. All right, now, that's Romeo and Juliet, William Shakespeare's famous play, written in, I believe, the 15th century. And yet the summary of it, because the present tense is used, gives it the feel that this is something that just happened or is happening now. It removes the distance from the story. And that is an illustration of what we're talking about, the way the present tense, because it makes it feel more immediate, also reduces the distance and makes the audience feel more involved with the story. All right, so tense is the first consideration here, and second is voice. Voice has to do with the active and passive voices. Active voice makes the audience feel involved. I already mentioned the way it gives punch to what you're saying. There are many, many benefits of the active voice that you should consider, and the reason why you should pay, I think, the most attention to whether you're using active or passive voice is because of the punch that it gives when you're writing or speaking. Active makes the audience feel involved, so it also has the added benefit of, besides being concise, it also involves the audience, and so it reduces distance. The subject performs the action. Statements are direct and strong. Passive voice removes the subject from the action, and in the process sets the audience at a greater distance. I want you to notice the subtle differences between two sets of statements. Set number one, active voice, Mary did the dishes. Passive voice, the dishes were done by Mary. Okay, so when I say Mary did the dishes, that makes it feel direct and personal. The dishes were done by Mary almost seems like, could you be more direct? Could you say it? Say what you mean there? So, and I understand I could illustrate it more in a bigger paragraph, but nonetheless, I want you to get a feel for the difference between the two statements. All right, now let's take a second set of statements. If I say, I take responsibility for this decision, again, that's more direct, it's more personal. The audience feels that you're speaking directly to them, that you're not trying to hide anything. And so the distance is reduced. The audience feels more involved and more, there's more of a sense of intimacy. They identify more with what you're saying. On the other hand, if I say responsibility must be taken for this decision, the question you would ask is, sure, but by who? By whom? You feel that I'm acknowledging that responsibility must be taken, but I'm not taking it. And so then you're wondering, who should take it? Should it just be taken by whomever? Part of the problem with passive voice is the dryness, the feeling of deadness, of lethargy. We get the sense that something might be happening, but we can't be sure that it's actually happening. Maybe it ought to happen, but is it actually happening? Strunk and White again say many a tame sentence of description or exposition can be made lively and emphatic by substituting a transitive in the active voice for some perfunctory expression as there is or could be heard. Let me again read to you some of their examples of this. Here's a set of statements. There were a great number of dead leaves lying on the ground. Now, that's what they're talking about. The expression there is. There were a great number of dead leaves lying on the ground. Okay? Now, we get the picture with that. It's not a bad statement. But consider an alternative. Dead leaves covered the ground. You see how that sounds more lively, more active, more involved? It's more descriptive as well, because you've done away with the passive voice. At dawn, the crowing of a rooster could be heard. Again, they had recommended doing away with that could be heard. Think about how to make that active so that the audience is more involved, so that it feels more colorful. The cock's crow came at dawn. That's a great sentence. Okay, consider this one. The reason he left college was that his health became impaired. Okay, now, again, you're saying what the reason was, and it sounds like, this is the way we normally speak. We usually speak in the passive voice. If you pay attention to your own words, you will pick out the passive voice quite often in your speech. A better way of saying that would be, failing health compelled him to leave college. Again, that's more direct, so it's more personal. And your audience feels spoken to, and it's punchy, and it's all the things that I've been recommending to you. It was not long before she was very sorry that she had said what she had. That's a wordy statement. Every time that we use the active voice, we reduce the number of words in the statement. She soon repented her words. Now there we go with 5 words. She soon repented her words, as opposed to the "16 words in the original statement. Brevity is the soul of wit, as they say. Of course, that's a passive statement, but that also reminds us that a statement does not have to be active voice in order to make it memorable, in order to make it punchy. There is that passive voice, but that is a statement of being that is necessary. Brevity is the soul of wit could not be better stated with the active voice. Of course, we'll not use simple sentences in most of our writing, so here are some simple rules for distinguishing. Let me rephrase that. When we write, when we speak, we won't always use such simple statements as what were used in the examples. And so, because of that, we need some recommendations, some simple rules so that we can distinguish between active and passive. You also have this use of the helping verb. We're helping, we're going, and so on. And you're wondering, am I using the active voice or the passive voice? First, passive voice requires an extra word in the form of a helping verb. The money was lost by me. It would be better to say, I lost the money. Now you've taken responsibility for it, unless, of course, you don't wish to take responsibility. Secondly, passive voice often includes a by phrase. In other words, the word by with a prepositional phrase, as a prepositional phrase. Increased understanding is gained by students when they are taught by those who themselves have a full understanding of the subject matter. You're tempted to think that because you use the verbs gained and taught, that you are using the active voice. But again, the statement is, increased understanding is gained by students when they are taught by those who themselves have a full understanding of the subject matter. It sounds like a great statement, but it would be better to say, students understand more when teachers who themselves fully understand teach the subject matter. There you have a direct active voice statement. It reduces the number of words. The active voice brings the sentence closer in proximity so that the listener can more readily identify. And this is the point of using the active voice, even in the spoken word. Now, the passive voice is more apparent in the written word because you're looking at it, you're seeing it, and the need for active voice is much greater in the written word. But in the spoken word, you also need to use the active voice. Your audience won't be able to pick it out as easily, but still they will be aware that you're wordy, that you say too much, you talk too much, or something like that, and of the increased distance between themselves and you. Consider this sentence. By the way, brevity decreases distance. Brevity decreases distance. Passive voice is always more wordy. In the example that I just gave, listen to the example again. Increased understanding is gained by students when they are taught by those who themselves have a full understanding of the subject matter. Now, again, that's a wordy statement, especially for the spoken word. It would work better in the written word, but the better statement, students understand more when teachers who themselves fully understand teach the subject matter. Again, the brevity, the active cut 9 words, the active statement cut 9 words out of the passive statement. All right, consider this sentence. With over 2 million cars serviced last year, mistakes may have occurred. With over 2 million cars serviced last year, mistakes may have occurred. Would there be a reason to keep a sentence like this? Well, the answer is, it depends on whether you want to take responsibility for those mistakes or not. Do you intend to assign responsibility to any one person? If you do not wish to throw your service department under the bus, then acknowledging that mistakes may have occurred without assigning responsibility is appropriate. But notice that you are naturally creating distance between yourself and your audience. Your audience does not identify with you as much. That can be strategic and for good purpose. Again, if you're in leadership, it is important for you to take responsibility yourself. But if you aren't the one who did it, and you don't know who did it, and you don't wish to impugn the entire service department, then an acknowledgement that you've made mistakes, that mistakes occurred, may be appropriate. Again, this increases distance. Your audience does not identify with that sentence as much as they would if you said, we made some mistakes with the cars we serviced last year. Notice that that statement is active voice. We made some mistakes with the cars we serviced last year. The version takes full responsibility without assigning responsibility to any particular person. You can also take responsibility while at the same time defending your people. Because we serviced over 2 million cars last year, we made some mistakes. Again, you're taking responsibility, and in fact, you're taking it on yourself rather than putting it on someone in the service department. That version creates a little more distance, but does not give the feeling that the service department is deflecting responsibility. The entire service department is taking responsibility. You are its spokesperson, and therefore you are taking responsibility. People, by the way, relate to you more if you don't reflect or deflect responsibility. Responsibility is an important element. You do need to take it from time to time. In general, the active voice states things directly, makes the audience feel involved. It enhances your ethos because it makes you sound honest, like you know what you're talking about and are not talking around the subject. The passive voice creates distance, but the passive voice can also be used to avoid taking responsibility or assigning it. It can also be used to hide ignorance. It can also give the impression that you're hiding something, or that you're not well informed, or that you do not care enough about your audience to be clear and direct. You need to be aware of all of these things because all of these things affect your ethos. And obviously, from what I've just explained to you, it goes beyond just the way that your audience relates to you or the way your audience identifies with you as you speak. It affects actually your integrity as you speak or as you write. The next element of style that affects voice and distance is word size. The size of the words that you use. Believe it or not, the size of the words you use will affect distance and identification. When a speaker or a writer uses big words or even unfamiliar or unusual words like rhetor, they give the impression that you are very intellectual. The speaker is intellectual. Even the word intellectual, by the way, sounds intellectual. Not because the word is unfamiliar to us, but, believe it or not, because it has more than 2 syllables. Syllables also make you sound intelligent. The technical term for big words is polysyllabic. By the way, the technical term for small words or one-syllable words is monosyllabic, which is funny because you have a big word, a polysyllabic, describing a monosyllabic. Polysyllabic words, generally speaking, have 3 or more syllables. And when I use a term like polysyllabic, I sound educated, exotic, maybe even foreign. I am also being more precise. That's the value of polysyllabic words. In general, bigger words are more precise. Polysyllabic, for example, is more precise than big words. If you say non-initiates, you sound more sophisticated than the person who says the people who don't know what you're talking about. The people who don't know what you're talking about are the non-initiates. And by using non-initiates, you impress the non-initiates. You also save a bunch of words. That's another value of polysyllabic words. You're able to be more concise, to use fewer words, be more brief. Brevity usually decreases distance. It helps your audience to identify more with you and relate more to you. But if you're trying to impress the non-initiates with your polysyllabic words, you risk losing your audience. Most of the time, the bigger the word, the more precise its meaning. So when your discourse calls for precision, use the technical term. But sounding educated or intellectual, especially in our day and age, and especially in our independent Baptist circles, can easily become a stumbling block to your audience. People think that you're talking over their head, even if you aren't. And if your audience thinks that you're too smart, most likely they will also think you're arrogant. And if they think you're arrogant, then they'll think that you do not have good moral character, or that you lack goodwill towards them. So there are advantages and pitfalls to using technical terms. Advantages and pitfalls to using big words. My advice, use big words sparingly. Very sparingly. Besides the fact that too many big words in one sentence gives the wrong impression, they will also create too much distance with your audience. As a general rule, smaller words increase identification. Bigger words increase distance. And besides that, bigger words affect the clarity of your speech. In fact, if you use more than just a handful of polysyllabic words in a sentence, you risk losing your audience. They won't be able to understand what you just said. Here's an example. The unwillingness of students to submit to the school close policy was a cause of the increase of strictness on the part of the administration. Now, I would guess that you didn't need to rewind and replay that sentence in order to grasp what was being said there. In addition, the sentence would be more easily understood, easier to read if you were reading it than if you're listening to it. Now that I probably blew that. The way that I said it made it hard for you to understand. So let me restate it. That sentence would be easier to read than it would be to listen to. Which is, by the way, something that you need to consider as you consider the difference between writing and speaking. Many times, the written word will be clearer than the spoken. You write a sentence and you read it. When you go back over it and review it, it makes sense to you. But when you try to speak it, when you try to say it, you find that your mouth stumbles over the words, and you can tell that your audience is not getting what you're saying. So, you need to consider the difference, especially using big words. You can get away with more big words in the written word than you can in the spoken word. Now, the sentence that I read to you does not deal with anything that is all that sophisticated. But the statement of it, the expression of it, may sound sophisticated. We're discussing school close policy. You probably all got that. The combination of multiple big words. By the way, notice what I just did. And the passive voice makes the sentence hard to grasp. So I would offer this improvement. The original sentence was, the unwillingness of students to submit to the school close policy was a cause of the increase of strictness on the part of the administration. That statement would be better expressed because students were unwilling to submit to the school close policy. The administration made it stricter. Or this statement, I think, would make it even stronger. The administration stiffened the school close policy because of unwilling students. The last statement has brevity, clarity, active voice. It's colorful, involved, it's direct and to the point. It is the better of all those statements. When it comes to word size, two things make an audience feel more at home with the speaker. First, smaller words, and secondly, and I believe more importantly, familiar words. Familiar words. You can get away actually with bigger words when they're familiar than smaller words that are unfamiliar. Take familiar, for instance. Familiar is 3 syllables, polysyllabic. But our familiarity with it blunts the impact. By the way, I just used the word blunts. I changed blunts from lessons, which is unfamiliar, which I changed from reduces, which is 3 syllables. Blunts sounds more direct, more personal than reduces, which is a bigger word, also familiar to us. Okay, so let me restate it using all 3 and notice the difference. Our familiarity with it blunts the impact. Okay, second example. Our familiarity with it lessens the impact. That sounds more distant. And the third example. Our familiarity with it reduces the impact. Reduces is a softer word. Blunts is a blunt word. Is that an onomatopoeia? I'm not sure, but it sounds like one to me. But moving on. Don't be afraid to sprinkle some bigger, more technical words into your discourse from time to time. Time to time, by the way, compensates for the earlier use of technical in that statement, and the use of discourse as well. Occasionally would be better than time to time, but occasionally is a polysyllabic word. Time to time is smaller, and because I already used discourse, which is a term that is less familiar, and technical, which is polysyllabic, I needed to compensate in that statement. And so I needed to say from time to time. Don't be afraid to sprinkle some bigger, more technical words into your discourse from time to time. From time to time helps you to be able to identify. For a moment there, I was about to lose you, and then I said from time to time, and I saved the day. Now, you might be thinking about right now, this is way too much. This is too much detail. And probably you're right. Your audience certainly doesn't want to think about all these things and won't think about all these things. But the devil, as they say, is in the details. And typically, a speaker or a writer who loses his audience or causes his audience to lose interest does so in small ways that no one really could put their finger on, but they do nonetheless. Be careful that you do not sacrifice precision on the altar of intimacy. In other words, for the sake of helping your audience to relate with you, you don't say what you need to say. Small words are more conversational, but you do lose some accuracy, and you need to understand that. But also be aware of the fact that you have more leeway with the written word than you do with the spoken word. You can afford to be more precise, to use technical terms, in the written word more so than in the spoken word. But on the other hand, when you're speaking to an audience, you have the advantage of reading their faces, their body language, the way they're responding to you as a speaker. You have the advantage of hearing your words as they're being spoken, so that you can tell whether your audience is hearing and identifying and understanding what you're saying. If the language you use is too technical, you can go back and fix it. You can explain what you mean. I've done that a few times in this lecture. With the written word, the audience has time to catch up. They can pause and look at the word for a moment. They can even go and look the word up. When you're speaking, the words run together and tangle in your brain, and there's no rewind button unless the speaker recognizes this and rewinds himself. One more thing on this. Don't be afraid to use a big word. Don't be afraid to use an unusual word or an unfamiliar word. A good